Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of May of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the Kherson direction, because during the previous day we got a lot of very important updates and details. And this is probably the most important one. According to several very reliable pro-Russian sources, the armored force of the Russian Federation managed to capture on islands of Dnipro along Kakhovka Dam. So the Russians are saying that all these territories were taken by the Russians. We're talking about these islands. As for reports that the Russians managed to cross the river and to enter the territory of Kherson, as for now we got several reports of this type, but without any proofs, without any geolocations. So you know that this is a very important situation, because since the beginning of April we've received probably 10 or tens of reports that the Russians are very active in this area. We got several reports that the Russians managed to cross not just this area. Let's add some arrows for better understanding. So once again today the Russians, according to different sources, captured this territory. Furthermore, we got during the previous 2 months reports that the Russians managed to capture completely islands in front of the city of Kherson itself. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians crossed the river of Dnipro and managed to establish control over some positions on the territory of the settlement of Pridniprovsk. Furthermore, according to reports we had during the previous months, the Russians captured islands in front of the settlement of Tyaginka. And now reminded, according to several reports, the Russians crossed the river of Dnipro and established complete control over the southern part of this area as well. Furthermore, during the previous months, we got reports that there were very heavy clashes for these islands in front of the settlement by the name of Kizomes. And also, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over this territory. So once again, the very important and the very interesting question, whether the Russians are planning to continue, whether the Russians are planning to cross the river of Dnipro and to attack the settlement of Kherson from the west, the settlement of Kherson from the east, whether the Russians are going to improve their positions in the vicinity of Kakhovka Dam. You know that when talking about Russian demands that were announced on the territory of Istanbul, Kherson is a part of Russian territory according to the Russian constitution, and according to this, Russians demanded Ukrainians to withdraw their forces from this area. So from this perspective, we see that Russian offensive operation in the area of Kherson is very logic. Of course, the Ukrainians consider this territory as a part of Ukraine, but now we see that the Russians have strong cards and the Ukrainians don't have cards at all, neither strong or not strong cards. Another important thing that, if you ask my opinion, I'm not sure that the Russians are going to cross the river of Dnipro. They still have a lots of job to do in the vicinity of the city of Pakovsk, Konstantinovka, Chasov Yar, the Sivers direction, the city of Liman. So lots of job to do without operation in the vicinity of Kherson. But I'll remind you that since the beginning of talks between Trump, Putin and Zelensky, the United States of America several times demanded that possible peaceful settlement between Russia and Ukraine, possible agreement between Russia and Ukraine, should include a paragraph that will allow the Ukrainians to use free access to the river of Dnipro. So the United States of America wants Ukrainians, when everything is settled, the United States of America wants Ukraine to have free access to this area. So most likely the Ukrainians need the river of Dnipro with the purpose to have possibility to use the river for trade, for cargo, for different ships that can bring goods and different cargoes from, let's say, the city of Kherson, from the settlement of Kazatske, further in the direction of the Black Sea. So this is very important, not just logistic, but a trade road, not just for the city of Kherson, but obviously for the city of Zaporozhye and Dnipro. So this is very important question for Ukraine and for the United States of America to have free access through this river. And the Russians also understand the situation, so that is why the Russians are trying to take under complete control every single island in this area. Because if the Russians are able to take every single island in this area without crossing the river and without taking under control the city of Kherson and so on, the Russians will be able to probably dictate their own rules of the use of this river in the future, if a peaceful settlement is going to happen ever. So this is a very important situation for the Russians, and most likely will continue, because this peaceful settlement can happen anytime, tomorrow, today, or maybe on Monday, when Trump is going to have a call with Putin himself. So any day. So that is why the Russians want to have strong positions in this area, and probably then, using these strong positions, they will be able to force the United States of America or Ukraine to sign some agreements in some other parts of Ukraine or along the entire line of combat contact. So let's wait and see what is going to be, but obviously the situation here is very interesting. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the South Donetsk direction, and during the previous 24 hours this is the most interesting and the most important direction. As you can see, we have a lots of icons in this area, we have a lots of changes on the ground, we have a lots of proofs, we have everything. So let's start from the beginning. During the previous 24 hours, the Russian sources, more precisely the Telegram channel, which is affiliated to the Group of Forces East, started publishing lots of statements about the situation on the ground. For example, this Telegram channel reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the northwestern and the western part of the settlement. So this is the article. Assault groups of the 29th Guard Combined Army of the Group of Forces East completed clearing buildings in the northern and the western districts of the settlement by the name of Bogatyr. So this is the first piece of news we got this morning. Later, the same source reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over 20 buildings on the territory of farms in the western part of the settlement. We're talking about these farms, and the Russians somewhere at, let's say, 1 p.m. of Ukrainian time reported about additional progress on the ground. So the first report we got in the morning, the next report we got somewhere at 1 p.m. As you can see, a very short distance between these two updates, which means that Ukrainians most likely were abandoning their positions and Ukrainians obviously were in a hurry. Several hours later, we got additional report from the same group of forces, and according to them, the Russians managed to establish complete control over 2 tree lines to the west of the settlement of Bogatyr. So based on all these reports and based on reports of different pro-Russian resources, we have adjusted this morning and during the day this part of the map as a contested area, because very reliable sources report about complete control, and we had several reports from different mappers. But right before we started making this video, the same source affiliated to the Group of Forces East published this video. And in this video we can see how exactly the clashes for the territory of Bogatyr were taking place. In this video we can see lots of episodes how the Russians were taking on the complete control one part of the settlement of Bogatyr after another, and how the Russians were raising their flags in different parts of the settlement. So during this video we can count more than 5 episodes how the Russians raised their Russian flag in different parts, and based on this video we have colored the settlement of Bogatyr completely under Russian control. So now we have no doubts that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation during the previous 24 hours, managed to establish complete control over this territory. So the Russians took Bogatyr, and there are no more Ukrainians, there are no more pockets of resistance. The Ukrainians abandoned their positions during this morning of the 17th of May of 2025. And you know that this is a very interesting situation, because we have another scandal, but this time we have a scandal from Ukrainian side. The thing is that this morning pro-Ukrainian sources from Deep State published very interesting article, and according to them, the Ukrainians of 33rd Mechanized Brigade counterattacked Russian positions on the territory of the settlement of Bogatyr, and as a result of counterattack, the units of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine managed to restore almost complete control over the settlement. The Ukrainians from Deep State reported that Ukrainians restored more than 95%, that the Russians had just several buildings under complete control in the southeastern, probably all in the southern part of the village. And to confirm this piece of news, Ukrainians published this video where we can see a flag in the most southeastern part of the village, but telling the truth, we don't see Ukrainian soldiers. We can see just a flag, and probably this flag was established by Ukrainian drone or something like this. But the Ukrainians used this piece of news to report that the village of Bogatyr is under complete Ukrainian control. Obviously, we can see completely different picture between the Russian sources and Ukrainian sources, because Ukrainians shown just the flag without anything. The Russians shown how exactly the clashes for the village of Bogatyr were taking place, and the Russians published maybe 5 or even more episodes with Russian soldiers with Russian flags in almost every single part of the settlement. So now we have no doubts that the Russians secured the territory and that the Russians continue advancing further in the western direction. So now let's compare the map between the dates, because this is very important. For example, this is the situation on the ground in the area of the settlement by the name of Bogatyr by the end of the 16th of May May of 2025. So this is the situation. The Russians were very far from the settlement of Odradne. When talking about the village of Bogatyr itself, we see that Ukrainians, according to this configuration, controlled by the end of the 16th of May of 2025 around, let's say, 40% of the village. And the most important, all these fields in the middle were also under complete Ukrainian control. But today we have completely different picture. Once again, the Russians managed to secure this territory completely, and the most important thing is that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to get as close as possible to the next village in this area. We are talking about the settlement of Odradne. Now we see, furthermore, that the village of Odradne is already semi-encircled by the Russians from the south, from the southeast, from the east, and from the northeast. And most likely the Russians are going to continue offensive operation further in the western direction with the purpose to take this village under complete control. And we expect that this might happen during the next 24-48 hours, or at least during the next this period of time. The Russians will enter the village and will take several buildings under complete control. But we have some doubts that Ukrainians are going to hold their positions for a long period of time, because Ukrainians have no, let's say, normal supply and support, because as you can see, there is the road N15. Yes, the Ukrainians still have possibilities to use this road, but we see no more barriers, no more strongholds, no more tree lines that Ukrainians can use, let's say, to hide their equipment if they decide to supply their forces. So a very huge distance between the settlement of Kamar and the village of Odradne. Basically, the Ukrainians need to need to move through the territory of almost 9 kilometers under open air under complete fire control of Russian FPV drones. So obviously this is something like suicide operation. So this is the reason why we decided, and we expect that during the next several days Ukrainians will abandon their positions and they will move further in the western direction with the purpose to organize the next defense belt around the settlement of Kamar, Perebudova, Zaporizhzhia, and Dachna. So this is the next defense belt of the armored forces of Ukraine, where they will try to slow down the Russians for as long as possible. And this is already the region, this is already the border between the region of Zaporozhye, Dnipro, and Donetsk. Of course, there is another settlement. There are two more settlements in this area. We're talking about Alexeyevka, Novoukrainka, even third settlement, Zeleny Kut, but we expect that Ukrainians will not be able to hold their positions for a very long period of time in this area, because we see there are a lot of strongholds. There is a very complex network of the fortifications, but this complex network of fortifications is located to the north of the settlements of Alexeyevka, Zeleny Kut, and Novoukrainka. And this, let's say, stronghold belt was prepared to repel Russian attacks from the north, probably, but not from the north and from the east and from the south and from the west at the same time. So this is the reason we expect that Ukrainians probably will try to hold the Russians in this area for another week or two, but I would say they will be forced to fall back in the very near future. Furthermore, because first of all, the Russians now have possibilities to attack the village of Alexeyevka from the south, and most likely they have already launched these attempts with the purpose at least to test Ukrainian defense and to understand what exactly the Ukrainians are able to do. At the same time, during the previous 24 hours, we got lots of reports that the Russians made several attempts to attack the settlement of Alexeyevka from the north and from the northeast. At least we have geolocations that confirm this. For example, in this video that was published by the 35th Brigade, Marine Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, we can see how Ukrainians were trying to attack Russian soldiers in this area, and how the Russians was trying to bring down Ukrainian drones with his arms. And this episode took place exactly in this area, and based on this video made small adjustments. So we see that the Russians are moving, trying to get to the village from the northeast, which means that the battle for the village of Alexeyevka is about to be started, both by the Russians and by the Ukrainians. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Pakovsk direction. The situation here is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians, because the Russians currently are focused on several strongholds in this area. During the previous 24 hours, we got this video where we can see how the Russians were bombing this stronghold to the south of the city of Pakovsk, and we understand that this is the next local small target of the Russians. Now the Russians are trying to take under complete control for as many as possible strongholds in this area, and as you can see, according to this map, there are a lot lots of strongholds. There are strongholds here, there are strongholds here, and the Russians are focused to take every single stronghold one by one. This will allow the Russians to create a very powerful foothold in the southwestern part of the city of Pakovsk and the Pakovsk agglomeration. Furthermore, I'll remind you that several mappers, yesterday pro-Russian mainly, reported about additional changes on the ground in the area of Zverova and in the southern and the eastern part of the settlement. So basically, when summarizing everything, we see that the Russians currently have they are tasked to take under complete control everything in this, let's say, pocket. And obviously, it will not take the Russians 1 or 2 days. It will take more time, but this is what the Russians are going to do, while the main Russian forces are trying to break Ukraine defense on the eastern flank of the city of Pakovsk. But telling the truth, it's not already the eastern flank, it's something like a breakthrough of Ukrainian defense, and we see that the situation in this area for the Ukrainians is already very critical. So let's discuss the situation on the ground in details. And first, let's talk about the start with the original flank. Today we got a very interesting article published by the pro-Ukrainian sources, by Deep State, and there are changes on the ground, as you can see. And according to these changes, we see that the Russians just managed to enter and to secure the southern and the southeastern part of Miralubovka. I'll remind you that the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported complete control over this territory a long time ago. Furthermore, the Russians published this video where we can see how the Russian soldier, this is the video, this is the moment I'm talking about, how a Russian soldier raised the Russian flag in the most northern part of the settlement. So take a look at these farms. These are the farms, and I believe that you will recognize these farms on the map as well. So this is the building where exactly the Russian soldier from this video was waving with the Russian flag. So we have no doubts that the Russians were already in the most northern part of the settlement. So this is a very big issue and big question, at least to me, why the Ukrainians haven't colored the entire village under complete Russian control. So maybe there are still some pockets of resistance from the Ukrainian side, and maybe the Ukrainians still have some doubts that the Russians managed to secure this territory completely. Anyway, we have a lot of proofs, obviously, and most likely in a day or in 2 days, the Ukrainians would do the same. They will color the village of Miralubovka and Mikhailovka completely under Russian control. So this is a very powerful and strong position of the Russians on the eastern flank. And today we start receiving videos of FPV drone attacks on Ukrainian vehicles and units in the southern part of the next village on this line. We're talking about the village of Nikolaevka. This is very important because the Russians began testing Ukrainian defense in the area of Novoekonomichne, so we expect that after the Russians clear this area, they will begin offensive operation in this direction as well. But most likely this offensive is going to start at the same time when the Russians finish the battle for the settlement of Malinovka and Mirne. They will try to attack Novoekonomichne at least from 2 directions, from the southeast and from the east. At the same time, the Russians are not wasting their time, they're trying to improve their positions, and today several pro-Ukrainian sources published this video, very important video that gives us lots of information. So in this video we can see how the Russians were attacking Ukrainian positions, once again using convoys of vehicles, very armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, different types of equipment, and in this video we can see how the Russians were moving in the direction of these pounds. So this is the moment, this is exactly when 2 Russian vehicles, at least we can see 2 of them in the video, answered this part with pounds. So this is exactly the facilities and constructions that you can see on the video. So these are the territory you can see right now in front of your screens, in particular in this episode. So we have 100% proofs that the Russians, as a result of offensive, managed to get this area and probably to land infantry and most likely to take this territory under complete control. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map, we have colored this territory completely in Russian favor. Furthermore, we got from the same video, there was one episode where Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians on the territory of the village of Novopavlivka. So based on this video, based on this episode more precisely, we have adjusted this part of the settlement. Several pro-Russian resources colored the village of Novopavlivka completely in Russian favor. Telling the truth, Right before we started making this video, we got another proof, another video where we could see the Russians in the most northern part. So the village of Novopavlivka indeed was completely taken by the Russians today. Most likely tomorrow the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information, but this video we will discuss tomorrow during the next update. So we will adjust the map accordingly, and we will color a lot of territories, obviously. So Ukrainian defense in this area collapsed completely. So, and this is a huge problem because we see that defense of Konstantinovka, Pakovsk, which used to be a single monolith defense probably months ago, now is nothing. The Russians managed to cut this territory into several pieces, and now the Russians will handle with every single one separately. And Ukrainians will be forced to keep their forces everywhere. They will have to keep their contingent on the territory of Pakovsk, and they're going to have to keep the same contingent on the territory of Konstantinovka. And there's going to be a moment of time when Ukrainians would be forced to make a decision where to send reinforcements, either in the direction of Konstantinovka or the city of Pakovsk. But obviously this is exactly what the Russians are planning to force Ukrainians to do. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation inside of the Kliban-Byksky pocket. As you can see, according to these geolocations, the main activities are taking place in the most southwestern part of this pocket, where the Russians face no barriers in front of them while attacking in the direction of Yablunovka, Alexandra Kalinova. I don't know why, I don't know what happened with Ukrainians, but since the beginning of 2014, the Ukrainians haven't prepared even a single stronghold, even a single defense belt exactly in this side of the pocket. The Russians managed to discover this situation, and now the Russians are trying to advance along the weakest part of this pocket, and we understand, and most likely Ukrainians either would be forced to send lots of infantry with the purpose to stabilize the situation, because this is the only tool they have for stabilization, but this could lead to significant losses from the Ukrainian side and refusal of, let's say, different units to continue their defense operation. So big collapse can happen here, and we see that everything is moving in this direction. So while the Russians are advancing here, other Russian forces are trying to pin down the Ukrainians inside of this pocket. So most likely the Russians will try to cut Ukrainians in cauldron in this area, and telling the truth, I expect that in the very near future the Russians will try to attack in this area as well, with the purpose to tighten the news around Ukrainian positions. Furthermore, today several pro-Russian resources reported that this is exactly where the Russians began. Today, according to several pro-Russian mappers, we see reports that the Russians entered the settlement of Romanovka itself from the east, and this is already the beginning of complete disaster. So once again, according to several pro-Russian reliable resources, the Russians entered the village of Romanovka and secured the most southeastern part of the settlement, which forced Ukrainians to fall back further in the northern direction. And if this information is correct, then possibly the positions, the distance between edge Russian positions in this part of the pocket is less than 4.2 kilometers, which means that Ukrainians who are currently located inside of this pocket have no chances for evacuation. They were cut by the Russians in cauldron, or at least they were cut by the Russians in operational encirclement. So we expect that if the information about the village of Romanovka is correct, if the Russians indeed enter the territory of this village, we expect that during the next 24 hours, the Ukrainians will try to evacuate themselves from this pocket. Otherwise, they will stay there forever. This is the only option for them if they don't decide to evacuate themselves, or if they don't receive any order from Syrsky or appropriate commander from this direction. So this is the situation, and obviously this is the reason why the Western countries and Ukraine are trying to force the Russians to accept this 30-day ceasefire, because without this 30-day ceasefire, Ukrainian lines in this area can collapse, and the Russians also understand this, and they understand that the longer they can hold the situation as this pressure with the pressure, the more territories and the better positions they can get before the beginning of real talks. Now let's talk about the city of Toretsk. The Russians continue improving their positions around the settlement. Today we got reports that the Russians, as you can see, managed to improve their positions significantly around the village of Deliyevka from the west and around the village to the east. So we have geolocations that confirm this. In this video we can see one FPV drone attack on position of sabotage and reconnaissance group, and in this video we can see another episode how Ukrainians were attacking the Russians on the territory of the railway station, the southern Deliyevka Novopavlivka. So the most important is that the clashes for the railway station has begun. So most likely the Russians will be able to shorten the distance in the very near future, and we expect the beginning of battle for this company Stronghold to the northeast of the southern Delievka. So this is very important stronghold. Control over this territory will allow the Russians to continue advancing further in the direction of the northern Delievka. So the situation here is very difficult, as you can see. When talking about the city of Chasiv Yar, we still have some doubts whether the Russians managed to secure the central part. There are several mappers suggested maps in this area as well, but according to these reports, there are still positions and pockets of resistance from the Ukrainian side. The Russians at the same time continue bombing and attacking the settlement of Konstantinovka, Drushkovka. So obviously the major battle of 2025 has begun. Probably not today. This battle began several probably weeks ago, somewhere in the early April. It's already months past since the beginning of the battle, and this battle will determine everything. And the most important, this battle will determine the terms of possible peaceful settlement of the conflict. Because this is not just the battle for the Kliban-Bykskaya water reservoir, this is the beginning of the battle for the Pakovsk-Konstantinovka arc. So for this territory, we're not talking about Slaviansk and Kramatorsk themselves. This is going to be probably the part of a major battle on the final stages of this battle in the late summer, or probably in the early autumn, not now. When talking about the Siversk direction, no changes. The Russians continue bombing the city of Siversk itself with FABs. Lots of FABs were launched by the Russians, as you can see, but without any changes. No changes in Verkhnekamenska, Grigorovka and Serebryanka. When talking about the Liman direction, no changes. The Russians are regrouping and preparing themselves before the beginning of another major offensive. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.